The engine screamed, a strained mechanical lament against the crushing cold of the Karelian winter. It was December 1941, and the temperature had fallen to nearly minus 30 degrees Celsius. Driver Ivan Burlikov gripped the wheel of his Gaz AA truck, his breath crystallizing instantly on the inside of the windshield. He wasn't on a road. He was on the ice, a 30-kilometer ribbon of peril across the frozen expanse of Lake Ladoga. Suddenly, a sound no driver ever wanted to hear, the sharp, metallic snap of ice yielding, followed by the terrifying, gurgling roar of water beneath the tires. Burlikov mashed the pedal, the little truck surging forward, escaping the fissure by inches. He saw the ripple of black water behind him, quickly sealing again in the frigid air, hiding the tomb it had briefly revealed. He checked his rearview mirror. The convoy of trucks behind him was a line of spectral shadows in the dense freezing fog, each vehicle carrying barely 3 tons of rye flour pittance against the 10,000 tons of food needed daily for the millions trapped in the city ahead. Every successful crossing was a temporary reprieve. Every broken truck, every shattered patch of ice, every man lost to the freezing depths of Lake Ladoga represented dozens of lives starving to death. Just hours later in Leningrad, this was the road of life, the vital artery against the Nazi siege. But how did one of the great historical centers of Europe, a city of 3 million souls, find itself staring into the abyss, sustained only by a precarious bridge of ice? The answer lies in Adolf Hitler's megalomaniacal strategy, the flawed Soviet defense, and a catastrophic underestimation of the Eastern Front scale. World War II, or the Second World War, began in Europe on September 1, 1939, when Nazi Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, invaded Poland. This aggression quickly drew France and the United Kingdom into the conflict. Following the rapid conquest of Western Europe, Hitler turned his attention to the east. On June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was launched, a massive, surprise offensive intended to eliminate the Soviet state, exterminate communism, and secure vital Lebensraum, living space and strategic resources for Germany. The German military plan was built on the principle of the Blitzkrieg, a lightning war that utilized rapid, combined arms coordination between armored panzer divisions and motorized infantry, supported by the Luftwaffe, to achieve quick encirclements and decisive victories. The Axis offensive was delivered by 3 powerful army groups. Army Group South targeted Ukraine, and the Caucasus oil fields. Army Group Center drove toward Moscow. And Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, was assigned the task of conquering the Baltic region and capturing Leningrad. Leningrad, the former capital of the Russian Empire and the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution, held enormous symbolic, political, and industrial value. Its capture was a priority for Hitler, who intended to raze the city and eliminate its population. Army Group North comprised the 16th Army, the 18th Army, and the 4th Panzer Group. They advanced quickly across the Baltic states, exploiting the initial chaos and the Soviet Army's unprepared strategic defense. By late August 1941, the German forces had reached the outskirts of Leningrad. The Soviet command rushed new divisions to the front, yet logistical failures, poor communication, and Stalin's purges of the officer corps had severely hampered the Red Army's ability to conduct an organized defense. On September 8, 1941, German forces successfully captured Schlüsselburg on the shore of Lake Ladoga, completely severing all overland rail and road connections to the city. The siege began, sealing Leningrad's fate to a 900-day ordeal. The only remaining, unblocked access point was the vast, inhospitable waters of Lake Ladoga, the largest lake in Europe. For a time, Soviet naval units used the lake for limited supply transport, but the onset of the brutal Russian winter would soon present an entirely new, potentially fatal problem. By November, when the first skim of ice began to form, Leningrad had only a fraction of the necessary food and fuel supplies remaining. The strategic calculation was simple and terrifying. If a dependable supply line could not be established over the freezing lake, the entire city would perish. But within hours, the immense logistical challenge of moving millions of tons across constantly shifting, freezing water would turn the battlefield into a crucible no engineer or soldier was prepared to face. The city of Leningrad entered the blockade facing a logistical catastrophe. The swiftness of Army Group North's advance caught the Soviet planners off guard, and the existing rail networks were wholly insufficient to maintain the city's 3 million civilians and the hundreds of thousands of military personnel defending it. By September 1941, when the Iron Ring closed, the official food ration for non-workers was barely enough to survive for 30 days. While industrial reserves of coal and fuel were rapidly dwindling, the specter of mass starvation and freezing death was no longer a theoretical risk. It was an imminent certainty. The only unblockaded sector was the eastern perimeter across Lake Ladoga. The initial Soviet response was desperate, relying on limited transport by the Ladoga military flotilla during the brief period before the Great Freeze. But sailing on the lake under constant attack by the Luftwaffe and heavy autumn storms proved unreliable. The only solution lay in a winter, when the lake was expected to freeze thick enough to support heavy vehicle traffic. This frozen lifeline would become known officially by the Soviet government as Military Motor Road No. 101. But to the desperate people it was simply the road of life, Doroga Zhizny. The logistics of the impossible, the strategic objective was simple: transport enough resources across the ice to prevent the collapse of the city. The operational execution, however, was monumental. The challenge was threefold: the ice, the enemy, and the distance. The ice. The initial planning began in late November, focusing on the narrowest point of the lake, running roughly 30 kilometers from the Soviet-held eastern shore at Asenovets to the staging areas on the western shore, such as Kokorevo and Kabona. Engineers of the Red Army and the Leningrad Military District needed ice a minimum of 20 centimeters thick to safely hold a light horse-drawn sled, and at least 50 centimeters for a 3-ton truck. When the first tentative routes opened on November 20, 1941, the ice was barely 10 centimeters thick in places. Horse-drawn sleds were sent first, moving 60 tons of food, a pitiful amount for the city's demand. The first true motorized convoy, composed of 350 Gaz-A trucks, rugged but light Soviet transport vehicles, was risked onto the ice. On November 22, 1941, the convoy carried 63 tons of flour, just enough for one very meager serving per person. Drivers were ordered to maintain speeds above 35 kilometers per hour to avoid the resonance frequency that could shatter the ice, yet remain slow enough to navigate the terrible visibility of blizzards and fog. They often drove with their cabin doors open, ready to jump if the ice beneath them gave way, a fate that hundreds would eventually suffer. The enemy, Army Group North, though bogged down by the mud and the ferocity of the Soviet counterattacks elsewhere, was fully aware of the single lifeline. German artillery units, particularly those from the 18th Army's sector, zeroed their heavy guns onto the western shore and ice routes. More significantly, the German Luftwaffe, particularly the I. Fliegerkorps 1st Air Corps, made the destruction of the ice road a primary mission. Dive bombers, including the notorious Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, patrolled relentlessly, seeking convoys to break up with explosive charges and gunfire. The Soviets responded by mobilizing anti-aircraft guns and the fighter planes of the 6th Air Army to provide cover. But the aerial attrition was heavy on both sides. The organization, under the command of Major General A.I. Stukov, the logistics operation transformed Lake Ladoga into a functional, if horrifyingly exposed, military installation. By January 1942, the road was officially open for 24-hour operation. Maintenance crews, defying freezing temperatures, constantly patrolled the routes, marking hazards with black flags, repairing broken ice with quick freezing slush and snow, and recovering submerged vehicles, often with their frozen drivers still inside. Fuel and ammunition were transported in addition to food, and on the return journey, the trucks carried the most precious cargo: the sick, the elderly, and the children, evacuating the starving citizens to safety. The morale and the cost. By January 1942, Leningrad was in the grip of the worst period of the siege. Rationing reached its lowest point of 125 grams. The road of life, despite its perils, delivered over 360,000 tons of cargo between November 1941 and April 1942, and evacuated more than 550,000 people. This monumental effort was fueled by the grim realization that failure meant the total obliteration of a major Soviet city. For the drivers, who endured frostbite, constant near misses with artillery, and the psychological trauma of seeing their comrades and cargo break through the ice, it was a daily act of desperate heroism. The road was a testament to the fact that, in this war of attrition, logistics and the indomitable will of the human spirit could sometimes prevail over the most meticulously planned military strategy. The siege would continue for another year, but Leningrad had received its salvation, a temporary, brittle bridge over a deadly lake. The road of life across Lake Ladoga was less a static infrastructure project and more a constantly shifting theater of war, where the enemy was not just the German Wehrmacht but the relentless, unforgiving force of nature itself. The first crucial phase of operation began in late November 1941, focusing almost entirely on battling the ice. Engineers quickly realized that standard protocols wouldn't apply. The ice layer, constantly expanding and contracting with temperature shifts, was riddled with submerged obstacles, currents that prevented uniform freezing, and unexpected fissures, the daily terror on the ice. The Soviet logistical network, initially utilizing primitive horse-drawn sleds for the first meager deliveries, rapidly transitioned to motorized transport by late November 1941. The Gaz-A truck, affectionately nicknamed the Politorka Little Half, became the iconic vehicle of the road of life. Though small and rugged, its capacity was severely limited. Drivers were often forced to carry less than 3 tons of cargo to prevent breaking the thin ice, often only carrying a few dozen bags of flour or loaves of the notorious blockade bread. The daily routine was an immersion into psychological and physical extremes. The drivers, often young conscripts or factory workers with minimal training, ran in long, disciplined convoys that followed precise routes marked by specialized traffic controllers and snow fences laid directly on the ice. Visibility was constantly poor, often reduced to zero by swirling blizzards or dense, freezing fog. The rules were strict and absolute. Maintain a set distance between vehicles, never stop, and, most importantly, never slow down on thin ice. Slowing down meant the engine's vibration could find the resonant frequency of the ice, turning the solid surface into a liquid, splintering trap. A significant tactical challenge lay in the German artillery bombardment. The 18th Army of Army Group North, holding the western bank of Lake Ladoga, continuously shelled the ice road. Guided by spotter planes and observers, the shelling had a dual purpose: destroy the transports and shatter the ice surface, creating permanent, treacherous holes that lasted for days or weeks. A direct hit from a 15 centimeters SFH-18 heavy field howitzer didn't just obliterate a truck and its driver, it created a lethal gap in the road, forcing entire convoys to divert or halt, delaying desperately needed supplies. The aerial duel, Luftwaffe versus a VVS, even more deadly than the shells was the threat from the air. The German I Fliegerkorps understood that the road of life was the city's Achilles heel. Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers and Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters became the ice road's aerial predators, using continuous reconnaissance and attack missions, especially during periods of relatively clear weather. The Soviet command committed numerous fighter regiments from the 6th Air Army to protect the convoys and intercept the German attacks. This aerial duel over the frozen lake was brutal. The Soviet pilots, flying often inferior aircraft models in terrible conditions, battled furiously to defend the vulnerable ground targets. The German pilots possessed an advantage in quality aircraft and experience, leading to heavy losses for the Soviet VVS Vojenno-Vostochny Sily. Yet their persistent defense denied the Luftwaffe complete control of the air. Without this cover, the road of life would have been impossible to sustain. Engineering and attrition. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was one of the coldest in modern memory. While the extreme cold posed a risk of frostbite and hypothermia for the drivers, who worked in unheated cabs, paradoxically, it eventually led to the thick, stable ice the engineers had been waiting for. By early January 1942, the ice thickness had stabilized sufficiently to increase cargo loads. Engineers, working in shifts around the clock, used primitive methods for crucial maintenance. They established mobile repair posts and utilized sophisticated ice reconnaissance to keep the road operational. Broken sections were mended using massive ice blocks and water. The resulting slurry would instantly freeze in the sub-zero air, creating a temporary, solid patch. The logistics included more than just supplies. A military pipeline and electrical cable were eventually laid beneath the lake's surface, securing a limited flow of precious fuel and power directly to the besieged city. A remarkable understated engineering feat conducted entirely under the threat of Axis fire. Despite these efforts, the attrition rate of men and material was appalling. Hundreds of trucks broke through the ice, and the cold claimed the lives of countless drivers and auxiliary personnel. However, due to the efforts of these logistics soldiers, by the end of April 1942, before the spring thaw rendered the road impassable, the convoys had delivered over 360,000 tons of supplies, primarily food, but also much-needed ammunition and fuel, and evacuated more than 550,000 exhausted and starving civilians. This was enough to avert total catastrophe, keeping the skeletal defense alive and the remaining population clinging to survival. The ice road was temporary, and the next challenge, the spring thaw and the relentless Axis attacks throughout the warm months, would be just as dire. The winter of 1941-1942 was a desperate victory of logistics, but as spring approached, the siege entered its most critical and treacherous phase. The temporary lifeline of the ice-covered Lake Ladoga was melting, forcing an immediate, all-or-nothing tactical pivot. The moment of maximum danger was the onset of the spring thaw in April 1942, the retreat of the ice road. As temperatures slowly rose, the solid lanes of the road of life began to fracture. The engineers and drivers faced a relentless race against rising water and collapsing ice. What was once a relatively stable route became a minefield of water-filled gaps, massive pressure ridges, and slush. The load limits were cut drastically, sometimes to less than 1 ton, and vehicle speeds were reduced to a crawl, ironically increasing their vulnerability. The heavy Gaz A trucks struggled through the slush. Maintenance crews worked frantically, attempting to bridge widening cracks with planks, but it was a losing battle. The most intense period of attrition occurred in late March and early April, where dozens of trucks plunged through the deteriorating surface daily. The emotional peak of this phase was the realization by the drivers that they were sacrificing themselves not just for Leningrad's survival, but for the principle of resistance itself. With each day, the chances of total loss increased exponentially, yet the convoys continued, pushing the boundary of what was physically possible over the disintegrating ice. By mid-April, when the last motorized convoys were pulled from the lake, the road of life had successfully prevented the city's outright collapse. Yet the relief was only temporary. The focus immediately shifted back to boat traffic across the now liquid lake. The summer gauntlet, Operation Hinged, the respite of the open water, was short-lived. The German command, recognizing the failure to starve Leningrad into submission over the winter, planned to crush the city in the summer of 1942. The main assault was Operation Northern Light Nordlicht, which planned to utilize the siege artillery and fresh reinforcements, including the 11th Army under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, newly arrived from the successful siege of Sevastopol. Crucially, the Germans recognized that the supply lines across Lake Ladoga had to be eliminated for this new offensive to succeed. This led to Operation Heidkraut, a concentrated campaign by the Luftwaffe Fliegerkorps to destroy the port facilities at Synopsis and Kobona, and to sink the Soviet transport ships and barges of the Ladoga military flotilla. The combat intensified drastically. German dive bombers and fighter bombers attacked the barges and escort ships day and night. The Soviet command, understanding this climactic tactical threat, dedicated massive resources to counter the attacks. Anti-aircraft defense, hundreds of 85mm anti-aircraft guns and rapid-fire anti-air machine guns were arrayed around the port areas and placed directly on barges. Fighter cover. The 6th Air Army launched continuous intercept missions, flying inferior Polikarpov I-153 and Yakovlev Yak-1 fighters against the German Messerschmitt Bf-109G planes. The turning point was not a single grand tank battle, but a desperate, slow, and grinding fight for aerial and anti-air supremacy over the narrow water routes. Despite inflicting heavy losses, including the sinking of several key Soviet transport vessels, the German air campaign ultimately failed to completely cut the water route. The sheer volume of Soviet air defense fire, combined with the dogged persistence of the supply flotilla, kept the minimal logistical flow intact. The Soviet decision to build and utilize submerged oil pipelines and electric cables under the lake surface further demonstrated an unyielding logistical commitment that bypassed the aerial threat and was impossible for the Germans to destroy from the air. The decisive counterblow, Operation Iskra, with the supply line holding, albeit tenuously, the Soviet forces prepared for their own tactical peak, breaking the siege ring. This culminated in Operation Iskra Spark, launched on January 12, 1943. This was the true strategic turning point for Leningrad. The operation involved a coordinated attack by the Leningrad front from the west and the Volkhov front from the east, aiming to link up near the city of Schlisselburg and establish a narrow land corridor to the city. The assault employed overwhelming concentrations of artillery and armored support against the German 18th Army, positions in the narrow bottleneck between the city and Lake Ladoga. After 7 days of brutal, close-quarters combat against the entrenched German defenses. The two Soviet fronts linked up on January 18, 1943, creating a land corridor only 8 to 10 kilometers wide. Though the siege was far from over, the Germans still held commanding positions. The continuous land connection was the strategic triumph that the Road of Life had paved the way for. Within weeks, the Soviet engineers constructed a new rail line, the Road of Victory, across this narrow corridor, allowing the final, full-scale influx of supplies needed to permanently shift the tide away from starvation. The logistical miracle of the ice road had done its job. It bought the time necessary for the Red Army to execute its long-planned counterpunch. The successful link-up of the Leningrad front and the Volkhov front during Operation Iskra on January 18, 1943, was the decisive tactical climax that the Road of Life had made possible. The land corridor, though only a perilous 8 to 10 kilometers wide, was immediately exploited by Soviet engineers. Within the month, a new single-track railway, the Road of Victory, was hastily laid across the narrow strip of reclaimed territory, and permanent structures replaced the temporary ice bridge. By February 1943, the first trains laden with tons of food, coal, and vital ammunition finally reached Leningrad's main rail network, marking the effective, if incomplete, end of the catastrophic siege conditions. The German 18th Army attempted numerous counterattacks, but the logistical tide had irrevocably turned against Army Group North. The direct land siege was finally lifted on January 27, 1944, after a massive coordinated Soviet offensive that pushed the German lines back dramatically. The city had endured 872 days of continuous encirclement and bombardment. Casualties and human cost. The sheer scale of human loss in Leningrad remains one of the darkest chapters of World War II. While military casualties were heavy on both sides, the civilian death toll was staggering and disproportionate, a deliberate consequence of Hitler's strategy of destruction. Civilian deaths, conservative estimates suggest between 650,000 and 1 million civilians perished during the siege, predominantly from starvation and freezing. The cause of death, dystrophy, or starvation, was the primary killer, accounting for over 90% of civilian deaths. People froze in unheated homes and died of exhaustion while trying to walk the streets. The evacuation, the Road of Life, was an artery of survival, not just supply. The convoys successfully evacuated over 550,000 citizens, mostly women, children, and the sick, to the safer inner Soviet territories. Between November 1941 and April 1942 alone, losses on the ice. Hundreds of drivers and transport workers perished on Lake Ladoga, either drowned in the icy depths or killed by German artillery and air attacks. Hundreds of vehicles were submerged, adding to the desperate scarcity of transport assets. Strategic and political implications. The survival of Leningrad, often against all military logic, had profound long-term consequences for the Eastern Front and the war as a whole. Retention of industrial capacity. Despite heavy damage, Leningrad's factories, fueled by the Road of Life, continued to produce vital military equipment. Factory workers, surviving on meager rations, produced T-30 for tanks, artillery pieces, and naval guns, which were critical for the defense and subsequent counteroffensives. Tying down German forces, the siege forced the Germans to commit a significant portion of Army Group North. For 2.5 years, this commitment included infantry, armored units, and crucial heavy artillery forces that Hitler desperately needed during the climactic battles further south and east, particularly the Battle of Moscow and the later Battle of Stalingrad, a symbol of unbroken will. Politically and psychologically, Leningrad became a powerful symbol of Soviet resistance and resilience. Its survival, against Hitler's explicit command for its destruction, inspired the entire Soviet war effort and demoralized German forces who expected a swift collapse. Lessons and legacy. For military historians and strategists, the Leningrad siege and the Road of Life offer crucial, often overlooked, lessons in warfare. The primacy of logistics. The operation demonstrated that logistics, not just firepower, dictates outcomes in modern, large-scale, total war. The Soviet ability to innovate using the ice as an improvised bridge, constructing pipelines, and defending the route under fire proved the decisive counter to the German blitzkrieg encirclement tactics. Adaptability and engineering audacity. The speed with which the Red Army and civilian engineers solved the challenges of transport across fissured ice, laid underwater infrastructure, and constructed the Road of Victory rail line highlights the immense importance of technical adaptability and wartime mobilization. The morale factor. The drivers of the Gaz AA trucks, battling the elements and the enemy for mere ounces of bread, exemplify the extraordinary influence of morale and desperation in sustaining a war effort. Their commitment prevented the strategic surrender that the Germans sought through attrition. The siege finally faded into history, but the scar left on the city and the nation remained. The road of life, a path of cracked ice, submerged trucks, and sheer human grit, is commemorated today as one of the great logistical miracles and sacrifices of World War II. It was a lifeline built of desperation, maintained by heroism, and delivered in defiance of death. No other battlefield of World War II so vividly demonstrated that the victory belonged not just to the soldiers who fought, but to the engineers and drivers who simply refused to let a city starve.